Welcome back to the Grain Growers series, or welcome if you haven't been attending some of the other webinars that we've been offering focused on grain here at UVM. So welcome. This is the last few webinars in our Grain Growers series, and the next two, today and tomorrow, will be focused on the anatomy of wheat flour. All right, so today is the start of the anatomy of wheat flour, and I'll be kicking off the webinar talking a little bit about some of the work we have going on here at UVM, specifically highlighting various aspects of field management, kind of what we can control in the field, or maybe things that are out of our control, and how those have a big impact on quality. And then I'll be followed by Randy George and Jeffrey Hamelman, who I'm sure most of you know. Randy is the owner and operator of Hen Baking Company here in Vermont, down in Middlesex, Vermont. Hopefully you've visited there before. And Jeffrey Hamelman is a certified master baker and an author of many books, and is joining us today to continue to share with us all the valuable information that they've gained over the years on wheat flour and grain quality and what happens in the bakery. So just want to welcome them. And then, of course, tomorrow we'll be joined by Andrew Hine, who is one of the co-owners of New American Stone Mills, also here in Vermont, and he's going to be focused on the milling process. So we'll be excited to hear more from him. And then finally, I just want to introduce Catherine, who doesn't always get a ton of FaceTime on these meetings. She usually has her Zoom off. And Catherine, of course, has helped us put all of this together, and we really appreciate all the hard work that she puts in to helping us with these events. The event will be recorded and posted on our website, usually a little bit after the webinar, so it won't be up there tomorrow, but probably if you check back in a week, it will be posted up there, and you can share it or listen to it again. Did I forget anything, Catherine?
I don't think so. I think you got it all.
Right. Okay. Probably more than what we even needed. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to talk briefly. Let me get this. Most of you know it's hard for me to be brief, so trying to watch my time too. So I'm going to talk briefly this morning about quality in the field. So what is it that we can control, or maybe have very little control over, in our farm operations with quality? And I wanted to quickly, of course, put in a plug for the E. Cummings Crop Testing Laboratory here at the University of Vermont that is managed by Hillary Emick. I know Hillary was hoping to join us. She is, I don't know if she is on. She was helping us with another project. Oh, she is on, helping us with another project today, getting cheese samples for us. So Hillary, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I can say hi. I did run and get some cheese samples this morning, and then stopped in back at my house to take the meeting from here before I go to the lab and drop off the cheese samples this afternoon. Yes, I'm the lab manager, and I process, and lab staff process pretty much all of our research samples and a few hundred commercial samples a year. We test for different mycotoxins, percent moisture, test weight, protein, and falling number for wheat samples. We have some additional tests that we can do on barley. And a lot of you that I see here in the chat do send in grain samples, so you're pretty familiar with that. And for those of you who aren't, we have a lot more information on our website about what those tests mean.
Thanks, Hillary. Thanks for taking the time to join us today, and hopefully you're on the whole time in case there's questions that pop up. And Hillary's been running the lab here at UVM since 2019 and doing a great job. And we appreciate her efforts in keeping the lab as a top quality resource here in the Northeast. All right. So she mentioned some of the tests that we carry out at UVM. And the reason we started the lab or initiated the lab in partnership with the Northern Grain Growers back in 2010, I believe. So it's been quite a few years now, is because grain quality testing services were not available to, not easily and locally available for the farmers in our region at that time. And as farmers became more interested in selling grain to local bakers and end users that were using it to develop different food products, we knew that it was a necessity to actually be able to test the quality of the grain, not just to bake good quality bread, but to also make sure that the wheat was safe. And one of the primary services that we offer is to test for mycotoxins, which of course I know most people on here know that mycotoxins can be really dangerous for humans and animals. So it's really critical to have that service easily available to growers here. But let's talk about some of the other quality parameters that influence, again, the quality of the grain that hopefully you'll be sending on to end users around you. And the first one I wanted to mention was test weight. Test weight is generally something that most farmers can measure pretty easily on their farms. And it is a measurement of quality. And if you were in a big, larger grain growing region and bringing your grain to the grain elevator, they would also be measuring test weight and making sure that the grain met sort of the industry standards for whatever grain was being grown. And if it doesn't, then there's dockage, right? So test weight is an easy indicator for many of quality. And it represents the density of the grain, right? And how many grains fit in a set volume. So you usually see this in pounds of grain per bushel. So how many pounds of grain can fit in a bushel, again, a volume. So test weight is influenced by genetics. So you'll hear this over and over and over again. Different varieties can have real differences in their test weights and also their ability to reach test weights. So variety selection is really a first step in making sure that you have the best chance at getting high quality grain. Now, test weight is also largely influenced by the weather. And we don't have a lot of control over the weather, as you know, or any control at all. And if we have adverse weather conditions, especially during grain fill, that can severely impact test weight. So if it's too wet or it's too dry, it can really reduce the test weight and the quality of the grain. Now, another thing that people may have experienced, but not really sure why it's happening, but we can see the test weights go down. So once the grain is mature, it hits physiological maturity, and we're leaving it in the field to dry down so that we can harvest it. And we get to, let's say, pretty close to harvest timing, like 17% moisture, let's say. And we start getting some long wet periods, and the grain starts to take up moisture. That actually will heavily influence the test weight of the grain. So the grain will dry down again, but it never dries down to the same size, right? It's sort of an interesting phenomenon. So you can actually see the test weight of the grain go down because you can fit less kernels in a bushel if we're getting really wet periods close to harvest. So there's a lot about the weather that can influence test weight that we can't necessarily control. But creating a good soil environment, fertility, and really paying attention to weather and timing at harvest is critical to making sure that we can maximize test weight. Now, of course, the maturity at harvest also influences test weight, because if the grain seed isn't mature when you're harvesting, then there's water in there. It hasn't reached its proper starch content, and that can also influence test weight. So proper harvest timing is really critical. And then lastly, whatever moisture content you have at harvest, if you have a high moisture content, again, that's going to reduce the overall test weight. So things we can control, some things that we can't, that again will influence the overall test weight of the grain. Now, I get asked this question a lot, and this isn't really, related to flour quality, but I think really interesting to talk about. And also looking at these numbers, you can see easily how low test weight seed can clearly have an influence on flour quality, but it can also have an influence on your next crop. So if you're saving your own seed, and you're saving the lighter seed to plant, and you're sending all the heavy seed, heavier test weight seed off to the bakery, just be aware that that low test weight seed, as you might imagine, it's lower quality. So also can have an influence if you're planting it. So if you look at this graph or this table, this is work that was done in the 50s in Kansas, you can see that the test weight of this variety was different going into the ground. So they planted heavy test weight seed that was close to the industry standard, around 60 pounds per bushel. And then they planted a lighter test weight seed, around 44 pounds of seed per bushel. Now, interestingly, when they looked at the germ rate of the seed, both had really high germ rates. So what happened afterwards, I thought was really interesting. Once they put those seeds in the ground, they ended up with a much lower emergence, as we might expect, in that lighter test weight seed. And the days to emergence were also much longer. So the seed didn't have as much starch, didn't have as much vigor, took longer to get out of the ground, and certainly the seed viability wasn't really there to create a full crop. So again, just thinking a little bit about the impact that test weight has on quality, both of saved seed you might be putting in the ground, and the seed that you're sending off for sale. All right, so moisture. I think everybody knows that the moisture content of the seed can have, various impacts on quality. And of course, we're always trying to harvest, get the seed out of the field, get it cleaned and into storage. But of course, the moisture that we harvest at isn't always the proper moisture for storage. And the proper moisture for storage may not also be the best moisture for milling. So there's a lot of pieces we have to pay attention to here. So having a really good relationship with the people you're selling to, and understanding what kind of moisture content they're looking for will be really critical to the end product. Now, you should also know that moisture, having even a slightly higher moisture content in storage, can attract pests, can cause molding quite a bit easier, and impact the overall quality in storage. So can we control that? Well, variety selection is key here as well, because we want a variety that fits well into our growing season. There are differences in maturity of grains, and so selecting a variety that fits best for your location is critical. Weather and environment, again, hard to control this, but when you're getting ready to harvest, just making sure that if you're pulling it out of the field because of adverse conditions, that you have the ability to get that seed dry in an efficient and timely manner. So drying equipment these days has become more integral to people's operations. Oh. All right, crude protein really reflects the protein concentration of the wheat, or whatever grain you're growing. And of course, there's a lot of factors that impact protein. And again, starting with variety selection. So whether you're growing spring or winter types, selecting a variety that we know has good protein content just from a genetic perspective is a good place to start, especially if you're looking for wheat that has high protein. So again, variety selection is key here. The type of grain, now of course, spring grains tend to have much higher protein concentrations than winter grains. And, these conversations with the people you're selling to are really, really, really critical. They may already have plenty of winter grain coming in from other farms, and they may really need spring grains because they come with this higher protein concentration. So variety selection, spring or winter types can all have major impacts on protein. Of course, soil fertility and availability of nitrogen to the wheat when it's growing is really important to making sure that you're maximizing the level of protein and meeting the needs of the people that you're selling to. And then, of course, there's just the environmental factors that can affect protein of the wheat. And mostly, in this case, if it's too cold, we can have slow release of nitrogen. If it's too wet, we can lose a lot of the nitrogen that's been put on the ground for the wheat to grow. And also, if it's too dry, that also may affect availability. So again, it's hard to control the weather. The things that we have in our control need to be managed so that we can maximize the protein quality and concentration. So here's just an example. This is actually some pretty old data that we collect here. This example is old, but we collect variety information and performance for wheat as well as many other grains here at UVM. And I'll give you our website at the end, but you can really see varietal differences with protein and other quality parameters that we're looking at. And again, I would suggest that you find these types of variety evaluations wherever you live. Hopefully there are some for your region, and take a really good look at them. So here you can see this is winter grains. There are some varieties that consistently have higher protein even as a winter wheat. And if you're growing winter grains and that's what you can grow, you really want to be finding those varieties. Redeemer is one that's very popular amongst growers and also very much liked by bakers because it is a winter wheat that has higher protein consistently. Now, again, usually the protein of winter wheat is still lower than spring grains, but there are winter wheat varieties that genetically can hold on to protein a bit better than others. All right, so initial end status of the soil is really important, and being able to meet the nitrogen demands of the crop is critical to having good yields, okay, and good test weight as well as many other factors. But when soil N is sufficient, it'll likely take the first bit of nitrogen to maximize yields. Once yields have been maximized, then it will continue to take nitrogen and build protein in the wheat seed, okay? So balancing that, right? Making sure that you have enough nitrogen to maximize yields and also enough to maximize protein in the wheat seed. So often when protein is slightly deficient or just enough, again, it will maximize yields or get the yields to, a certain level, but the protein will suffer. So again, managing nitrogen fertility in the fields is really critical to making sure we're reaching the genetic potential of the variety. And there's a lot that goes along with this that we don't have time to get into, and I'm happy to share some of the work that we've done in this area. So falling number, here's a picture of the old falling number machine. We just got a new one, and Hillary really loves it, and it's helped us be more efficient in our work. But, I'm sure most of you have heard of the, analytic falling number, and it's an indicator of kernel germination or starch sprouting. And it's a pretty simple test that is run in our lab. Again, sort of mix water with the flour, and then you drop a plunger through that mix. And the slower the plunger moves down through the mix, the higher the falling number is. And we're really looking for a falling number, over 200. And again, Randy and others will talk more about this in their presentation. I've had this slide for a really long time and I haven't shown it for a while, but just to give people a sense of what it looks like when you have a low falling number, what's happening in the seed. You can see right up here on the top, it says viable, no pre-germination. And you can see the embryo and the starch around it, this beautiful white starch that's there to feed the embryo when it gets ready to start growing. And then if the starch begins to become degraded, you can see how that starts to look in the seed. So you can see viable pre-germinated, and then another picture of viable pre-germinated, meaning that the plant will probably still germ, but the quality of the seed is going down, right? So the germ might be going down, and that seed viability that we were talking about a few slides earlier. So, what happens here is you get the seed to physiological maturity in the field, right? That's at 37% moisture, and we don't harvest at 37% moisture, right? Most of us are using combines, so we must wait for that seed to get down to a proper moisture, and many of us are waiting to get that seed below 15% moisture. Now, a lot can happen. Once the seed is mature, it means that it can produce a new seed, right? It can sprout and start to grow. So when it's sitting out in the field, it starts to go through a dormancy period, right? It stopped growing. So it'll go into a dormancy period, and some seeds, some varieties hold dormancy longer than others, and some just immediately are ready to start a new life. So when they're sitting in the field on the plant and it gets wet, right? And maybe some sunlight or moisture, whatever the conditions are and temperature, the seed triggers itself to think that it's time to start germinating. So the embryo releases an enzyme to start breaking down the starch. And as that happens, the starch begins to degrade. Now, if it's in the field and it dries again, this process stops, but you've already started to degrade the overall quality of the seed. So what we're trying to do is get seed out of the field that looks like this. This is the best for planting. This is maybe not exactly the best for all purposes, because this number can be too high, as you'll hear. But this is what we're looking at. And just some pictures of high and low falling number bread. So it's very critical to baking. This is some genetics, so it is important to evaluate genetics and falling number. We want varieties that can hold their falling number, and some of this has to do around that dormancy. So looking for those varieties that are holding falling number in our trials are really important. Harvest timing also heavily influences falling number. Here's some studies we did many, many years ago. And again, the longer that grain sits in the field before it's ready to be harvested, right? It reaches that harvest moisture, a lot can happen, and a lot of degradation can happen of the seed quality. So getting that seed out of the field timely is really important. So that might mean that you have to harvest at higher moisture contents. And again, this is really dependent on the weather and your ability to be able to handle wet seed. All right, the last piece I'll talk about, because I have 3 minutes left, is vomitoxin management and DAWN. So this is our primary mycotoxin that we deal with small grains. I'm sure all of you are familiar. The disease that produces the mycotoxin is Fusarium head blight or Fusarium graminearum, also called head scab. And when the plant or when the disease impacts the plant, especially the seed, and it infects the seed, then the fungus itself may or may not produce this vomitoxin called deoxynovinol, DON. And that's what we're measuring in our lab to make sure that the levels are low enough that they won't impact human health, but also grain quality. So let's talk about that a little bit. Fusarium, and this is the hard part about it, is that there's some controls that we can work on or management, like good rotations. So cereals or grasses after grasses, especially corn, can increase your chances of getting Fusarium. Corn harbors Fusarium in its residues, and corn is very susceptible to Fusarium. So corn, wheat rotations, or corn and barley, whatever small grains you're growing, are not the best because that residue harbors Fusarium. Getting rid of the residue will definitely help. So growing wheat and other grains in rotations that are, diverse is really critical. But unfortunately, Fusarium blows around in the air. And so if you're in a high corn growing region, especially, or grain growing region that has these wet, humid conditions, and relatively warm, it's really difficult to avoid Fusarium in a heavy, sort of outbreak year. But rotations can help. And variety is absolutely critical in managing Fusarium. So selecting varieties that have tolerance and some resistance to Fusarium should be essential in our region. And you can see some varieties here that did not have any resistance in a year where DON was very low, right? So you definitely want to avoid these types of varieties. All right. If you do have a high DON year, there's lots you can do to try to clean up the seed, especially when you go into harvest and you get into cleaning. So here's a beautiful picture of a healthy wheat seed followed by seeds that have been impacted by DON or maybe even other conditions, other issues. And you want to get rid of these, right? You want to get rid of these 4 and keep number 1. And getting rid of these, there's a variety of things that we can do, and I've listed them here. A lot of it is a lot of these shrunken kernels and light test weight kernels that have been impacted by disease can be blown out of the combine by slowing things down, making sure you've made appropriate adjustments and turning up the fan speed. A lot of different things you can control in harvesting to try to get rid of this and bring those DON levels down before you start bringing that grain into storage. So just remember that. And then also, if you are harvesting wet grain, you need to dry it down as soon as possible because that DON is able to continue to develop when the grain moisture is, around 18%. So, if you're pulling it out wet, make sure you get it dried down. And then just more cleaning if possible. Definitely just cleaning with a clipper cleaner, even a rotary screen cleaner will help start to get rid of some of those light kernels, infected kernels. And if you have access to gravity tables and other seed cleaning instruments, that will also help. So you can still end up with a viable crop or a crop to sell of high quality seed by having different tools available to you. All right, so like I said, lots of things we can try to manage in the field, from getting the grain planted out on time, making sure weeds are controlled, lots of different agronomic practices. Here's just some photos of weeds in late planted grain. all of these things impact the final quality. So just paying attention to those is really critical. Good agronomic management, good variety selection, and then proper harvesting, cleaning, and storage will hopefully lead you to some high quality grain. And here's our website, so you can visit, and I'm gonna turn this over to Randy and Jeffrey.
Do
we have
Thanks, Heather.
questions?
That was great.
Yes, thank you.
I'm looking in the chat, and I see Susan put in our research reports. Thank you, Susan. And Catherine put in the testing lab info. And I think probably a lot to think about for folks. And if you're not a farmer, may not even be applicable. But I think with that, I will let you folks get started.
Okay, I am working on remembering how to get the whole thing here.
Slideshow up top.
Thank you.
And then click
all the way
from
up.
beginning.
From beginning, there we go. Well, thanks everybody, and thank you, Heather. It's a perfect introduction, I think, to what Jeffrey and I want to get into as we go from the field to the bakery. So Jeffrey and I have worked for probably at least 10 years now on sampling in the bakery, doing test bakes with a lot of the grain that Heather has grown, the wheat that Heather has grown in the test plots there. So a lot of the information that Heather has just shared, we'll talk about how that carries over into the qualities that we see in the bakery. You want to say anything else, Jeffrey, about?
Well, one thing really struck me in Heather's presentation when she talked all too briefly about falling number. We'll get into that more later. But I think it was our last test where we did the blind testing of rye varietals, and the results were all over the map. But it turned out it was only one varietal that we were baking. The difference was the harvest date was different. And at some point it got very rainy, which really just totally changed the falling number. And the results were not based on varietals, but simply on the environment. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. And of course, with rye, if we were doing a rye presentation, the falling number discussion would be very different because it's not necessarily of such concern. In fact, it may be of benefit to have the falling number significantly lower than what you want in wheat. But absolutely, that whole discussion is really interesting. We have a particular challenge in the Northeast. Typically, it's a very rare year, I think, when a farmer could let their grain just dry out in the field. So everything that Heather said is really so important. And when I tell people about how we've come to this point where we can use now, we have good baking results from Northeast grown wheat. A big part of that story has to do with discovering that you can get a much better falling number by harvesting earlier, although it does mean that you have to figure out how to dry it down post-harvest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been a wonderful evolution, and it's been at least 10 years that we've been doing those samplings, those trials.
Yeah, that's right. So I just thought, what's that, Jeffrey?
I just said, anyway, off you go with the slides.
Okay, yeah. So this is a slide that a sort of slide that people might have seen before, but I think it's just important to remember what it is we're talking about here, and the percentages in particular. Roughly 83% of wheat berry is endosperm, which is primarily starch and protein. That's where most of the protein is, and all of the starch. And that will vary. That exact percentage will vary depending on the size of the grain, probably more the kernel more than anything else. And
when we get into milling this, we're picking this apart, you know, so that then the 14%, 14.5%, as they say here, that is bran, the outer layer, is either going to get ground up and incorporated in the flour in the case of whole wheat, or mostly removed in the case of white flour, or somewhere in between. And that somewhere in between world is something that Andrew will get into in greater depth tomorrow in his presentation. But this is, you know, understand that white flour is primarily endosperm, and whole wheat flour is all the components that you see there. And then we'll talk about that in between world as well. And then hopefully everybody has their samples that I think it would be helpful for people to take a look at numbers 1 and 2 in the little containers there, because that is grain in real life here. And these are samples. If you orient that so that you have actually two on your left and number 1 on your right, those correlate to the test results that are up on the slide. And that's those are the results that Heather was describing. The E.E. Cummings lab will give you when you send in samples of grain. So these very samples resulted in these results. I will note, and this was very wise of Joe at Elysian Fields to do. He was harvesting grain, the same variety, Redeemer, from 3 different locations. And you know, Heather talked about some differences that you'll see from year to year, but depending on the condition of the soil, or even the aspect of the land, or how much wind is going to get there, if there are tree breaks or not, all of these things can affect the quality of the grain. So it's interesting. It's kind of one of the reasons I like that slide, is that it shows how what differences you might see in the exact same grain that was planted and harvested within days of each other, but from different fields. So when Jeffrey and I have done these bake tests, we're careful to do them blindfolded, but then later we'll be shown this information, and then this can help us, and hopefully help us to instruct other bakers as to the things that we might be able to expect to see when we get into milling and baking with grain from these samples. So a lot of these things were discussed by Heather. The test weight is there. I think we're not going to have time to go through this in excruciating detail, but when you look at the samples in front of you, there's an obvious difference in grain size. We see that the Redeemer from Elysian Fields, sample number 2, is much bigger. The grain size is obviously bigger, more plump, and the other one, the bowls from Morningstar, is smaller. And that probably has, it accounts for the difference in test weight, because bran is very light. You know, when they separate bran out and they put it into a bag, they use what would hold 50 pounds of flour to hold 25 pounds of bran. So effectively, when a grain kernel is smaller, it's going to have proportionally more bran, more of the outside part. So my guess would be that would have more of that influences the test weight here, since all of the other numbers look good. Because as Heather said, if the falling number were low, that would also have probably show up in the test weight as well. Are there other things, Jeffrey, that you might comment on if you were considering baking with these?
Well, only that the one with a higher proportion of bran would probably not perform as well in the bakery.
Yeah,
Because you're having a lower proportion of endosperm.
that's right. Assuming that we're going to make it into whole wheat flour.
Or
Right.
possibly even if it was turned into white flour.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing that offsets that to some degree is the protein. And it may not have been, it is listed on the samples that the Redeemer is a winter wheat. And as Heather pointed out, the winter wheat almost always has lower protein when compared to a sample of spring wheat. And it's quite a bit lower, as you can see here. So although that that spring wheat, the Bowles sample number 1, has smaller grain size, lower test weight, the protein is significantly higher. So significantly that my guess, and I can talk about my actual experience with it, is that it will have at least as good baking qualities. So I guess maybe that's everything. Well, we want to see that the Dawn is low. And on the next slide, I just want to point out some things that would probably be no-go situations for people if they've received a sample, they have these test results, and there are certain numbers that you really need to look at and scrutinize. The Dawn level, Heather discussed that. It is not allowable to sell grain with higher than 1 part per million Dawn. This may or may not be regulated. We are subject to FDA inspection here at our bakery, and they have asked us how we're ensuring that we have a Dawn level of less than 1. In the case of, if you're buying commercial flour from any mill that wants to stay in business, you can be assured that the Dawn will be under 1. But you may even be asked to supply the FDA with the test results that mill got. So certainly, if you're buying directly from a farmer, you want to know this number. I'll note that in Canada, the limit is 2 parts per million. So nobody seems to be dying in Canada. So there's maybe a difference between what's allowable in the US and what is in fact safe. But that's all up to you. I will say that I have had a couple of occasions where we've had grain that came in at about just slightly over 1, and by blending it with another sample that was at least under 1 by the same amount that the other one was over, I felt confident that we were getting something that did not exceed 1 part per million.
Mm. And I think too, Randy, we should point out that, if the Dawn is too high, then it's non-negotiable. That grain is no good. But there are things bakers can do if the falling number is too low for wheat, or if the protein is too low. So you could add diastatic malt to increase some enzymatic activity if you had a really low falling number. You could use
Other way around.
Oh,
right?
the way around. If you had too high, of a falling number. That would be one strategy. And as far as a protein being too low, you could use a sourdough to increase dough strength. You could use some kind of a yeasted pre-ferment to increase dough strength. So there are some strategies that work in the bakery that can help you somewhat offset grain that isn't coming in at the optimum numbers.
Yeah.
Randy, there's a couple of questions, and Jeffrey.
Yes.
Yeah, Eric wants to know, hi Eric, did you find that ash numbers are more indicative of the endosperm to bran ratio for baking and milling quality purposes?
we'll get into ash when we start to get into milling. So I have some slides that concern ash. As was talked about when we were talking about grain size, I mentioned that the percentage of bran will vary depending mostly on grain size, but probably from variety to variety as well. So it's not common to, I don't believe, to measure the ash content at this stage in the game with whole grain, although it will vary. I hope that answers the question.
And yeah, there's another question too, if you see it. Do the proteins in the bran and germ affect baking quality?
The protein you're going to find in the endosperm, the starch in the protein, that's the function. The endosperm functions more like the white of an egg where the protein is. So the germ is like the yolk of an egg that gives the first burst of nutrition to the developing embryo of the chicken. And then the long-term storage comes from the protein in the egg white. And there's a similar analogy when you get into wheat, where the germ is what's going to kick off the next generation of wheat, and the protein in the endosperm is going to be the long-term nutrient storage for the developing plant. So the wheat's not thinking, oh, I can't wait to become a loaf of bread. The wheat just wants to perpetuate the species.
As far as protein does go down when you mill, as you refine flour, and actually not, I believe that indicates that that a certain amount of protein does exist in the bran.
Yeah.
And that would be not gluten forming protein, so not useful for baking. It wouldn't affect the baking characteristics anyhow. I want to note that all of these 4 things that I would that at these numbers I would say I don't want to bake with this, they can be corrected. Heather discussed some of that regarding probably maybe all of these characteristics. Dawn, she talked about running it through a gravity table in addition to other forms of cleaning is likely to reduce the Dawn level. That's of course entirely connected to it being too dirty, having other impurities in it. The falling number, we saw this last year with a sample from a farmer where additional cleaning brought the falling number up to a usable level. And then moisture, we've discussed drying it down. And I will note that that moisture level is lower than would typically be used by a roller mill, where they would want it to be 14%, but I'm assuming that most people are going to be stone milling here, and the temperatures being a little bit higher in stone milling, there will be issues with those higher moisture levels. But it's, if you got a sample from a farmer that was actually looked like, the reason I put this particular photo up here is because this is from our farmer that we work with in Quebec, who pulled that handful right out of the combine. He's still going to clean it after that. But this is a good illustration of what you would get with poor cleaning. He had a cover crop of field peas. You can see that's what the larger kernels are there. And then there's an unthreshed grain, at least one there that I see, perhaps some chaff here hanging out. These are all things that you don't want. That's not helpful for bread baking. So you may get a sample that has one or more of these issues with it, and it doesn't have to be the end of the story with that farmer, but you do need to ask them to see what else they can do. And except for the last one, moisture, cleaning could be the answer. So then we start to mill it. Then we start to break it down, however we're going to do this. And as we say, Andrew's going to go deeply into this with stone milling and the mills that he makes. We have one here at our bakery. They're now all around the world, and they're quite appropriate for a small bakery, scale wise, investment wise. And that's the way that grain has been milled since the beginning of bread baking, really. But I wanted to talk a little bit about roller milling because we've all used white flour. You know, that's what it's often mislabeled, technically speaking, just flour. I mean, it's what we think of when we get when the recipe says all-purpose flour. That's produced on a roller mill. Jeffrey and I had the opportunity to go to a mill in France a few years ago, and I saw the much older roller mills than I'd ever seen before. You know, this technology was invented in the late 1800s, and that roll stand there dates from probably about that period.
And it was Hungary that was noted for the quality of their wheat, and it was Hungary that developed the first roller mills, I think in the 1870s or thereabouts.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And what happened, oh, well, this one was, it's just fun that this is, they were water powered, the early ones. This one has all these shafts, and then all the, it brings the grain up in these bucket elevators rather than pneumatic systems that would be used today. But really the principle is the same, has been all along. And what happens is you're really dissecting the kernel of wheat through a series of rollers in pairs. And you can see both rollers in this slide here. They have these grooves running laterally, and they, in this photo, they appear to be different sizes. This is the first break, meaning that this is a coarse milling to try to peel off as much bran as possible. Those two rollers are turning in opposite directions and at slightly different speeds. So what happens is that when the grain is pulled into them, it's rolled. And you know, so it spins that wheat berry around and starts to peel off the outer layer of bran.
And then with each successive with each successor pair of cylinders, they're spaced closer and closer together so that you get a more fine break. And the corrugated ones, I think, are only for the first 5 breaks, after which the cylinders are smooth.
Yeah, and that's this.
There can be up to 20 breaks or more.
Yeah, and this is showing that final one, that smooth one. Yeah, so it's called a gradual reduction mill, and so it's not all in one pass by any means. As Jeffrey says, maybe up to 20. Typically, it would be rare to have it be less than 10 passes. This is actually a photo of 10 pairs. Each roll stand has 2 sets of rollers. This is from the mill at Moulin de Sède that we buy a lot of white flour from at our bakery. It's right on the farm, and they brought this mill over from France and refurbished it. It's about 75 or so years old. And then you see these tubes, which are the modern version of those conveyor systems that that used to be the bucket elevators. Those are transporting the results of the milling up. This is what it looked like in that same mill that has those antique ones. Its current iteration is this here. There's Jeffrey in the slide. But these are really the same thing. You know, they work faster, and they're all shiny and everything, but they're really not doing anything differently than has been done for close to 150 years in any roller mill.
And one thing that I think we should point out, that if you stone mill grain and get whole wheat flour, it's a really, really different flour than if you get whole wheat that's made in this kind of a mill, where literally there might be 20 separate streams coming off the mill, and then it's recombined at the end to turn it into whole wheat flour. It's a very different animal when you do it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, this really excels at milling white flour. It's not made for, as Jeffrey just described. It, when you say it's different, I'll put a qualitative point on that. You know, it's really, I've taken the same wheat, had it roller milled and then recombined and stone milled, and it's far superior as a stone milled flour. if we're
Yeah,
talking
one
about.
thing I think that's could be a factor is that when you stone mill it, the oils of the germ are embedded in the endosperm. So you've got this intact product right from the beginning, which you don't have in a roller mill situation.
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah. And then you see this can happen at different scales. This is the much smaller scale mill at in Quebec at Moulin de Sèvres, but that same thing's happening here. What's pretty complicated, up and down every time it goes through the rollers, and then the grain is sent up. This is what it looks like at the bigger mill, and then back to the antique thing. But what's been happening, what is an integral part of any roller mill is that then the grain, as it's being broken apart, is sent through these bolters. And so those are shaking around, those boxes are, and then the flexible tubes there that allow the results of the sifting process to go in either direction depending on particle size. So larger particles will usually get remilled, and then you're saving the smaller particles. So it goes, the grain, when we say it goes through the rollers, if it goes through 20 sets of rollers, it also has to go through 20 sets of bolters. It's going up and down all those times. And this is the bolters at Moulin de Sèvres. Bolting, it's the miller's term for sifting, but it comes from the bolts of fabric, which are used, have various density, will sift out particles of different sizes. And this is what it looks like on an even larger scale. But those things, you can't see it in the photo, but it's like this huge thing. It's a little disconcerting to have this whole thing shaking there, but that's what's, and those rods are suspended from this, are attached to the ceiling, and the bolters are suspended from the ceiling so that they can shake around. But it's really just a sifter. It's no different than what you would do if you were to take a sieve and shake your flour out there at home.
Interesting, talking about sifting flour, it reminds me that we all love that French term boulanger for the baker, the ball maker, the boule maker. But it wasn't until the 13th century that they were called boulanger. Prior to that, the baker was called the talamelier. The root for that was tamiser, which means to sift, because the baker did the sifting, right? And depending upon the buying power of his client, they would sift it either coarsely or finely. The finer stuff obviously costing more for the people that had the money. But the baker was the sifter, not the miller.
Yeah. And we come to today where we have, since the advent of roller mills, which operate on typically such a large scale, white flour is typically less expensive. It's important to point out that the grain moisture content in a roller mill is brought up to about 14% in big tanks like that you see. This is from Heartland Mill out in Kansas, and that they'll add a small amount of water because you don't want to store grain at that high of a moisture content, but they'll add this water to facilitate better separation. Otherwise, they would not get as high yield. There would be more endosperm clinging to the bran, and they would just be throwing out valuable, what could be flour if it's separated better.
I'm seeing a question here, Randy, from Louise, who seems to have experience where some wheat varietals can be grown as spring or winter. My understanding is that those are completely different biological metabolisms, and a spring wheat can't be planted in the fall and vice versa. Heather, can you put a little more clarity to that question?
Yeah, I was just typing a long answer to Louise, but yes, they're called facultative varieties, and some of the older varieties like Red Fife, Turkey Red, in some places, I wouldn't say we have had success with this in Vermont, but in some places they can be grown as winter or spring wheats. But again, it depends where you live. I think it also might depend a little bit about, you know, where those varieties kind of came from. But that is, oh, somebody else is typing in one that they're growing as well. And so part of her question was about, does the protein content vary? So if it's a variety that we know has high protein, is it high in the winter and just as high in the spring? And there have been papers done on that, and spring grown wheat, whether it's facultative or not, generally is higher in nitrogen. So yeah, I'll respond it a little more in the chat.
Heather, I believe that a lot of farmers, particularly in the Northeast, prefer growing winter wheat if they're not going to have winter kill issues, because the yield will be higher and the weed pressure will be less since it gets a head start on everything else in the spring.
Yeah, well, that is true.
And
it's harder to grow spring wheat often in many of our soils here because it needs to be planted really early, like now, and even in Vermont last year we were planting right now. So if you have really heavy wet soils, it's really hard to get on them early enough in the spring to plant cereal grains. So the winter grains provide more flexibility, higher yields, and better weed competition, but lower protein.
And that last bit is the part that's where the bakers become a pain in the butt. We start to say, oh, well, we want that higher protein. And it's not that we always want, absolutely, like 15 or more % protein, but in the Northeast, as I understand it, typically when compared to Midwestern environments, if we're talking about the US, the protein is going to be lower whether it's spring or winter. And so we're going to be, for many winter wheat crops, down at the lower end, which is why on a commercial basis for the farmers that are growing winter wheat in this state, in Vermont, most of them have ended up growing Redeemer because it seems to have about 2% higher protein than other ones that have been grown. And as Heather's slides demonstrated, it does quite well from a dawn perspective and a falling number perspective as well. Somebody had a question about, could a roller mill be used to dehull spelter rice? I don't believe so. I think it's very much designed to mill hulled grain. In the case of combined and cleaned grain. All right, so this talks about moisture. I think this has been pretty well discussed between Heather and us today. I'm trying to get back to there we go. This is exactly what Jeffrey was talking about earlier, how if you take different samples from a roller mill, in the different stages after the passes through the rollers and the passes through the bolters, this is what the roller mill is doing along the way. Most of these are not finished flour. I mean, maybe the bottom left hand ones are, but the other ones are, and B1, B2, those are the break. That means the first break, second, third, etc. So you see how the grain is getting lighter and finer as it works its way through the roller mill. I think this is the only mill I've seen like this, but I've heard of them existing, and I think this is such a fascinating thing. This is at the same mill that Jeffrey and I visited in France. They make roller milled a flour that runs through a gradual reduction stone mill. So remember, I said gradual reduction. Typically, that's a term we use to refer to a roller mill, but there's no reason it can't be done with a stone mill with an older technology And presumably this has 6 stones, so not as many passes as a roller mill would have. But once again, those tubes send the partially the grain up as it's being broken down to be run through bolters, and then it goes through another set of stones. And presumably these stones are dressed differently in the same way that the rollers were constructed differently, so that you get finer and finer flour. And the great benefit that I'm sure you would get from this is that because you are pulverizing the entire grain, including the germ, which has all that good flavor and nutrition in it, you're getting that germ worked right into the endosperm. So then somebody had a question about ash content earlier, and this is where we get into that a little bit. You know, as I say, I think about this when we're talking about milling flour, and this is a measure that is usually done when we're talking about flour rather than when we're talking about grain. And the reason it's called ash content is because I believe now it's usually near infrared is the method that it's measured by, but it used to be that the lab would burn a quantity of flour, and the unburnable part, the part that's basically not calories, not combustible, is the ash. So that is a measure essentially of the refinement of the percentage of endosperm. You can also look at, or the percentage of bran in the flour. So if you look at your sample number 4, that's white flour. This was milled at that mill in Quebec that there were some photos of. That is about 0.55% ash. The French would call that type 55. So it came down from whatever the raw grain was, probably a little over 2%, down to around 0.5%.
And if you contrast that number 4 with number 3 from Andrew and number 6 from King Arthur, you can see a very distinct color difference. Those last two having a higher ash content, more minerals remaining. The test itself, not the NIR test that you mentioned, Randy, but the former one where you put the 50 grams of flour into a little teeny oven. It's super exciting because all of a sudden you see this flame come when everything incinerates, and it's like more fun than TV.
I haven't seen that. That's great. Why am I not advancing here? There we go. This shows the relationship between extraction rates and ash content. There's some confusion with this. I will say, you know, typically a small mill, certainly not a in bakery mill, and in only rare cases, I think, would a commercial mill, a small commercial stone mill, have be doing regular ash tests. What you can easily measure, of course, is the extraction rate. So if you dump 100 pounds of grain into the hopper, how many pounds of flour do you get if you're bolting it, if you're sifting a certain percentage of it out? And you can state the extraction rate. That correlates to the ash content, but it is not the ash content, and it may, depending on how your mill is set up and what your extraction rate is, depending on how your stones are grinding it and what screens you're sending the grain through, your extraction rate could vary for a given ash content. So it's kind of a squirrely measurement. Extraction rate is, because basically I think what it comes down to is that more or less of the endosperm could be clinging to the bran that is getting discarded. So you could have an extraction rate that would seem to indicate that it would be lower ash than it is. That white flower sample, number 4, that's about 75%, between 72 and 75% extraction, but it's about 0.55 ash. And that's, I think, a sort of written, should have had that slide up while I was talking. And then I referred to the French classification type 55. You know, in Europe, I believe that certainly bakers and many, not just professional bakers, but many home bakers are familiar with these different classifications. We live in this white and whole wheat world as if those are naturally, as if white flour is a naturally occurring thing, and unchangeable. You know, the exciting thing that Andrew's going to get into more tomorrow is that there's a whole world in between whole wheat and white, and lots of exciting baking potential there, particularly if we're talking about stone milled flour.
And we might want to note that if you're talking about French classification or German, they mill on a 0% moisture basis, unlike in the US where it's 14%. So if you had type 55 in Europe, it would be about type 48 in the US.
Right, and the same, you have to think about the same thing for protein, which is what this is doing here. So when a French baker talks about their protein level, it's different than an American baker talking about their protein percentage. So it's good to refer to something like this to do that calculation. It's basically, simply, all you need to do, I mean, it can be done on a calculator. You have to remove the moisture if you're going to talk to a French person, basically. You know, we won't get deep into this, but there's a whole set of tools that mills will make use of to test the baking qualities of flour. We don't have these available to us in Vermont. On occasion, I've had the mill in Quebec send away samples to go through an alveograph in particular, which is pictured here at Heartland Mill in Kansas. And this produces interesting information for that correlates more to what we see at the bakery. You can see that bubble there. That's just what that is. This alveograph instrument mixes dough and blows a bubble with it. And essentially, what you're talking about there is you get a measure of the elasticity and the extensibility. The elasticity being the strength, the force with which it takes to stretch the gluten, and the elasticity, or the extensibility, how far it will stretch. So it's measuring the amount, the force with which the air had to go into that bubble to blow it, and then how far the bubble went. And then there's this curve is produced with various numbers that some mills, you know, larger scale mills do this test. That Heartland is among them. I think of that as not that different than what I was doing here with some whole wheat flour that we were testing for UVM. It's bakers do it all the time, and that's of course less precise and somewhat subjective. But that's what we've got to go on if we don't have an alveograph available to us. But I think it's helpful to think in terms of this. We call this pulling a window. If I'd taken that photo with a good light behind it, it would be translucent. How far can we pull that before it breaks is extensibility. How hard it is to pull it is the elasticity. And the balance of those two and the amount of those two characteristics is influenced by the grain variety, certain other agronomic factors which have been studied but are a little harder to put a finger on, and also the milling, a variety of wheat. All these things come into play. But we have all kinds of tools that any good baker can use at the bakery, including varying hydration, mixing times, folding more or less.
And I find those, Randy, cumulative to be at least as valuable as the numbers that come off some machine in a lab. You know, we get to know so much about the characteristics of the wheat by things like how we mix it, the hydration, the folds, and all that, as you say. And, you know, I think if you could only have the lab results or your hand results, I personally would go with the hand results. As you know, I just came back from training bakers at that refugee camp in Uganda, and the doughs that they mix there are typically very highly developed. So I taught them how to do the window pane test. And as we looked through it, I said, look, you can see Tanzania.
Yeah. No, that's exactly. I mean, you were training people to be sort of good bakers, but also kind of rudimentary lab technicians of a sort, you know. I mean,
Which is what most bakers become. We become lab technicians by doing the things you're describing.
Yeah, yeah. So that we hopefully get to this, you know. I mean, what we look for typically in, well, I mean, there's all kinds of styles of bread, and I'm not prejudiced towards, you know, a bread that looks necessarily like that. But what the final loaf tells us is something about gluten development and things like extensibility and elasticity. You know, this is basically a solidified version of what we saw back a few slides ago in that alveograph picture, where, you know, there's a bunch of bubbles happening there, and how far those stretch has to do with how extensible that dough was, and how well that loaf stands up has to do with how elastic the dough is.
But the same flour done by two different bakers with two different mixing styles or hydration styles, you could have photos that look pretty much completely opposite from these, just based on how the baker is treating the grain.
True. And there would also be samples of grain that I would challenge any baker anywhere to turn into a loaf looking like that. You know, in other words, there are certain characteristics, not only of protein quantity, even though that's a factor, but also the protein qualities, which would make it very difficult to come up with results that you might be looking for.
Agreed. Yep. And then at the same time, there are some flours, I mean, rye obviously is one of them, where the results are going to be dense, but dense is a characteristic. It's not a criticism necessarily.
Exactly. And it sounds like from what you've told me about the baking in Uganda, they're looking for a different kind of bread.
Yeah.
And so there may have been fat added to it.
Yep.
Yeah. And it was a stiffer dough.
Well, I could eat any one of those pieces of bread in that slide, Randy. With pleasure.
You know, just briefly, a farinograph is another baking quality test done on flour. That's simply having to do with strength. It's the
most commonly one used in North America. You don't see the alveograph that often. It's really the farinograph that rules, and it's the opposite in Europe.
Yeah. And so this graph is produced from a farinograph, and basically it's a mixer with a meter on it that's measuring the resistance. I've actually done a very rudimentary way of doing that is to, if you have a small mixer that runs on regular 110 power, you can get these at places like Home Depot, these meters that measure the draw, and as the motor works harder, as the gluten's being developed, you see that number go up. So that's really what, you know, in a more precise way, what a farinograph is doing. Falling number, I think Heather discussed that in pretty good depth. But I wouldn't think about trying to bake good bread with wheat that was less than 200, and I'd much rather see it be 250, if not higher. And a milling white flour will add diastatic malt or fungal alpha amylase to increase the amylase activity, and which brings down the falling number to 250. In the case of white flour, they measure that carefully to get to right around 250. And hopefully we end up with that at the end. We have a few minutes for questions, if there are more that have come in.
Yeah. So there was some conversation around frost seeding wheat and just people talking about that strategy to get the wheat planted or grains planted earlier in the spring. And I would say, especially with the climate warming and these inconsistencies, at least in my experience, of how long spring lasts, that really early planting is becoming increasingly important. So thanks for sharing folks' experience with that. And then there's another question there about the slide that listed characteristics of wheat that are non-starters for good baking. Can you elaborate on why anything above 13 or 14% moisture is unusable?
You
Yeah,
touched on that, didn't you? When in your presentation, Heather, you touched on excess moisture.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of storage issues for sure, and
Right.
I'm sure Andrew will talk about some of that tomorrow with milling.
yeah, and I think, I mean, certainly my listing it at that on that slide had to do with milling. And quite honestly, when we were talking about this presentation with Andrew, I got that number from him because I probably would have said 14%, but he'll confirm this later. But I think that he said 13%, which I am guessing a little bit here, but I think that this has to do with the higher heat that you can have in stone mills, and it's simply a matter of gumming it up. I've had it happen with our stone mill, where you can, in real bad cases, you can do what's called pasting the stones, where you basically get all this paste rubbed into your stones, and they can't really mill anymore. They have to be taken apart, and that has to be chipped out. So you obviously don't want that to happen. It's important to note that it's as long as the farmer has the right drying equipment, it can be corrected as long as it was not stored for a long period of time at levels above what, Heather, 16% or something?
Yeah, I mean, really, you want to be stored below 15%.
Yeah.
Yeah. It looks like there's another question about optimal storage conditions for finished flour.
Yeah, so I think we're talking about I'm going to assume that we're talking about some kind of stone milled flour, meaning it has the germ that's volatile. It's in other words, it's not going to last a real long time. Jeffrey, you're going to be able to probably give us some more insight on this, because I know you've done specific experiments with this out in Washington, but it might sound funny to say, but I believe I'm correct in saying less than 3 days or more than 21 or something like that.
Yeah, that was my experience with white flour, where I took flour that was milled at the bread lab, and it was actually milled to white flour. It was still slightly warm when it went into the bowl, the mixer. I made baguettes with it, and they were incredibly good. The flavor was amazing. And then it goes through this down period. There's some kind of metabolic activity that makes it not that useful for baking until these disulfide bonds develop slowly over the course of time, which takes 3 weeks. So why it's good after for the first day or two, and then it goes through this lag phase, I have no idea, but that was definitely my experience. When it comes to whole grains, you know, as soon as you mill it, it's started to go rancid. That's not exactly accurate. It's like saying as soon as you see a newborn, you don't say, oh, wow, he's starting to die. Well, yeah, he's not, you know what I'm saying? But in terms of flavor and nutrition, baking with whole grain flour as soon as possible after milling is going to be the best route to go for sure.
And maybe, would it potentially go through the same kind of degradation process in terms of baking quality? I'm just talking gluten formation ability after 3 days.
You know, I don't know, Randy, but I think there's such a trade-off in flavor and nutrition that even if the baking quality reduces in whole grain, it's still probably worth doing it as soon as you can because you're going to get the best flavor and nutrition.
Yeah. And then temperature certainly comes into play somewhere there. I know that I've seen at Heartland Mill in Kansas, they have a huge room that they keep at 50 degrees or so. And that's where all of their flour that has the germ in it, you know, basically they make a bolted flour and they produce whole wheat flour too. That's not so much of a concern for the white flour. But if you can't use it within a few days, keeping it on the cool side, it doesn't need to be refrigerated, but not more than 60 or 70 and maybe more closer to 50 would be much better.
And humidity is going to be a factor too. It shouldn't be completely dry or overly moist either, the environment for storage.
Yeah.
Well, great. That was fun and very informative, and we're getting lots of good feedback in the chat. So thank you, Randy and Jeffrey. We are almost at 1 o'clock. Looks like we have about a minute left. And so if there's any final questions or comments, please type them into the chat. And I want to thank everyone again for joining us today. And thank you, Jeffrey and Randy as well.
It's a pleasure, Heather. Thank you. And thanks everybody who took the time to listen in.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Have a good day.
See you tomorrow.
Bye. Yes. See you tomorrow.